So, first of all, thank you to everybody for joining. I'm just going to run through a few bits of ISF admin. First of all, a few notices. We have Eric Kaufman's podcast going live tomorrow, both on YouTube and on Substack. So make sure you sign up to the Substack. If you're not on the mailing list, jump on for that one. If you are a paid supporter, our podcast with Richard and Anya will be going live for you sometime this week, probably mid-week, towards the end of the week. So you get those podcasts a week early. And then on Friday, Johnny and I will be chatting to Razib Khan. So again, if you are a paid supporter, you will be able to submit questions in advance. So for just $5 a month, you can become a member of the ISF community and get access to fancy live streams like this and all sorts of extra perks.
Extra fancy.
Yeah, as well as the 3 bonus questions we ask every guest. But today we're obviously doing something slightly different. We're hosting this conversation between Johnny and Bo. They're going to be talking about human nature and political philosophy. If you haven't read the Quillette article, you can find that on the Substack. But Johnny will be summarizing it for you in a hot minute, so you don't need to leave. What we're going to do is they're going to have a free-flowing conversation, and if that free-flowing conversation breaks down at any stage, I will interject with all manner of annoying questions, including your own. So you can pop those in the chat now, and yeah, we will get right to it. So, Johnny, do you want to summarize the article you published in Quillette last year?
Sure. I'll do that, and I'll just say first, thanks, Bo, for doing this. I mean, how many hundreds of calls have we had? I'm just I don't know. I think this is going to be like us on a phone call because, the sin that both of us have committed, the ultimate sin, is just being maximally open and just saying whatever's on our mind. And the problem is, we've done in public exactly what we do on the phone. So I guess this is just an extension of a phone call. But I'll go ahead and quickly summarize the article. I don't want to take up too much time. Let it be a conversation. But it was actually a year ago that we wrote this. And the occasion, if I recall, there's really 2 things. Bo, I know, maybe still is, writing a book on political philosophy. He's got a couple book projects. You can talk about that. And the other thing is, go ahead, Bo. Yeah.
I'm actually I'm writing a novel, so that one's on the back burner. Okay. But I do read political philosophy quite a bit, so yeah.
Yep. So the other occasion is I came to Ecuador in part because a friend of mine, you guys already know this, but a friend of mine is now the chief policy advisor of the president. The president had won his election a little over a year ago. And I was getting some heat back at the university from some faculty who's trying to cancel me. So I just said, fuck it, I'm leaving. I'm leaving my job and I'm going to go to Ecuador for the year. And it was cool because as soon as I got here, the president of the university and the president of the country, those are 2 separate people, basically asked me to create an Oxford-style PPE program. And my buddy, who's the counselor to the president, Aparicio, asked me to create a class called Human Nature and Political Philosophy because he had read Pinker, he had read Plomin, a number of these people, and he had done a degree, a PhD in political science, and he thought, this is what's missing from the public debate. This is obviously what's behind wokeism, this sort of blank slate theory. I think we all kind of agree that's a big part of it. So I created a class, or I was in the process of creating it, and Bo and I wrote this essay, Human Nature and Political Philosophy. So that's kind of the background, and that class is actually up and running now. It's going to do its first version in a couple months here. And we've had a number of visitors come to Ecuador from behavioral genetics, from political philosophy, from adjacent disciplines to kind of give their views on to what extent we should even connect human nature and political philosophy or political societies. Political philosophy being, of course, moral or normative thinking about how political societies should be developed as opposed to how they actually work. So, which is more like standard political science.
Can I already disagree with my fellow?
Okay, yeah.
Bo, by the way, they're saying in the chat that your mic is quite low, so you'll have to shout at them.
Okay, so I was just going to disagree to some extent in that it's not political philosophy is not necessarily normative, right? You could have descriptive political philosophy. Would we agree with that? So, philosophy of science, you have normative philosophy of science, and then there's descriptive philosophy of science. Like, how does science work? Why does it? So you could have, like, how do politics work? Why are some political regimes more successful than others, for example?
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah, the tradition has always been mainly normative, but then when you look at, say, Plato and Aristotle, they do have like metaphysical views, and views about, for example, not just what human nature is, but how that sort of conception of human nature, just as an example, might influence what kinds of institutions we have. So I guess you could like separate those two things. So, for example, Aristotle famously says man is a political animal. And what he means by that is just we're social creatures. So it's natural for us to bond, to live together in communities, right? Not just families, but bigger than families. Okay, is that political philosophy? I guess it is, even though that has literally no implications yet. But he's going to say it has implications, because if we are a certain kind of creature, then we probably should try to live a certain kind of way together. So I guess you're right about that. I'll concede that point. I don't think it matters much, but yeah, we tend to focus, I guess, more on normative questions, especially in like the modern world, modern political philosophy. But I guess you're right about that. Sure. Should I just outline? I'll just outline the article that we wrote real quick, and then let's get to it, just because it gives us a framework. So I think we had 5 parts in that article a year ago. First one was basically a really simple claim, a modest one, namely that having a viable view of human nature, doesn't necessarily imply that a particular kind of political society should exist, but it does constrain the set of viable options. So, for example, it does tell us, if we know something about like human tribalism or human selfishness or human generosity and the limits of human generosity, it does tell us probably communism at scale isn't going to work. Communism within the family might work quite well. It's probably even recommended. Socialism of some variety on a really small scale can actually work pretty well. Israeli kibbutzim show that's true. There are Christian communes that work pretty well. But at scale, it doesn't work at all. And so like our first claim is, all right, we need to pay attention to human nature, but it doesn't strictly imply a particular kind of society. It just sort of, I guess it's a kind of sieve. Would you agree with that, Bo?
Yeah, I think of it as like a limiting factor.
Right.
So
exactly.
We can imagine all kinds of social arrangements, and some seem more pleasant than others. But if those imaginary social systems are not at least congruent with human nature, not only are they doomed to fail, but they're also often doomed to fail tragically. That is to say, they lead to suffering, misery, indigence, etc. Right. Communism is a great example, right? The way I think about this is with evolutionary stable strategies. Like I used to say this in my class, like, okay, what would happen if you had an organism and all of the organisms just shared everything with each other? Well, very quickly you would get a genetic mutant that would exploit those organisms, and therefore unadulterated cooperation is not an evolutionary stable strategy. It's not possible to get it because it would be invaded by a mutant. The same thing holds for political systems.
Yeah, I guess the only exception to that, and it's remarkable that Thomas Hobbes, of all people, recognized it, is, Hobbes talks about the fact that humans do live together and kind of need each other, even though he's an individualist. But he says we're not like bees and ants. And what's fascinating about that is he writes that almost 500 years before the idea of eusocial creatures is innovated. I think it's E.O. Wilson and some others who came up with that idea. But as we know from bees and ants, they're actually, in a way, not separate organisms. They're like an extended phenotype. So the queen bee shares her genes with all the worker bees. And the same thing goes for ants. And so their genetic interests are identical with their overall interests. And unlike humans, where we share some degree of our genes within the family, within a group, within all of humanity, bees and ants share nearly all their genes. And so weirdly, you actually could build a perfectly, you might say communist society, whatever you want to call it. The beehive is that. But it's really because a worker bee is almost like a skin cell on your body. It's just an extension of this phenotype where as long as the overall organism is reproducing, it doesn't matter if you sacrifice one or two or three. But that's really not true for human beings. Even though we share a lot of our genes, we still have our genetic self-interests that are pretty different than bees and ants. Anyway, just a little footnote on that.
I would add a small qualification, which is there is some debate in the literature about the exact path to eusociality and the specific amount of genetic material that is shared. It depends on the actual the sex of in bees. It depends on the sex. So
right.
Some share 3/4, 75% of commonly descended genetic material. And that does change the calculus. But some people have argued, including actually, I think Edward Wilson came to think this, that it was actually more social selection that drove the genetic relatedness rather than the other way around. So there's a lot of debate in the literature. Point is, there's something called kin selection, which is you're actually still selecting for the allele. So if I sacrifice myself for 3 children, for example, if we do a genetic count, that's actually an advantageous sacrifice, genetically speaking, other things equal, right? So yeah, that's what Johnny's getting at. And Hobbes, you're right. I hope we get into Hobbes because he's one of my favorite thinkers. Spectacularly wrong in my view, but very interesting.
Can I just raise an interesting observation here? Well, I hope it's interesting, which is it seems to me that this is where political philosophy in general becomes incredibly important, because I was thinking as you were both speaking there about Thomas Nagel's famous essay on what it's like to be a bat, as we talking about bees and eusociality. It seems that if we were to ask the question, for example, with the advancing technology, whether that's genetic engineering, putting AI chips into our head and developing super intelligence, would it be desirable? You could ask this question, therefore, quite feasibly. Would it be desirable to say, okay, we want to aim at becoming a kind of like Mr. Spock style creature, or becoming more eusocial, right? And these we've kind of glimpsed something like this with cultural technologies and like technologies of the mind, like mindfulness, meditation, all of these things. And probably most people within that Eastern framework would make the argument that this is a universal good. But if you follow Nagel, right, you would probably go the opposite way and say, actually, it's not possible to say what it would be like to become this different type of species. And therefore, just be careful where you tread. Would you both agree with that?
Are you familiar with the vampire problem? Because this sounds exactly like the vampire problem.
Oh, yeah, I think I have. Yeah, go on, outline it for people.
Yeah, okay. So, like, Russ Roberts talks about this in his new book, but it comes from another philosopher who wrote a book on transformative experiences. But the vampire problem is basically this. Like, the question is, should you become a vampire? And let's suppose that it's painless to become a vampire. And we talk to vampires and we're like, hey, what's it like to be a vampire? And the vampires are like, it's kind of cool, it's not too bad. Now we're thinking, well, it seems kind of disgusting. You have to subsist on blood, which seems repellent, right? But the point is, we don't know what it's like to be a vampire, and vampires don't know what it's like to be a human, or at least anymore they don't. And the experience are incommensurate in some ways. Like, how could we possibly compare those two experiences, right? Like, once you become a vampire, you're no longer a human, and you actually have this preference for blood. And actually, I think this is just one case, and Johnny and I might actually disagree on this, and I would like to see where you come out on this. I think this kind of undermines utilitarianism, because ultimately what it's suggesting is there isn't one ruler which we can use to measure mental experiences and add them together. Because in some ways, each mental experience is a smaller example of the vampire problem. I don't know what it's like to be Johnny. Johnny doesn't know what it's like to be me. People who are single don't know what it's like to have kids. People who live in one kind of society don't know what it's like to live in another kind of society, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, this is also, as you know, there's a lot of cross-pollination between philosophers and economists. So David Hume and Adam Smith were good friends, and they both wrote on both subjects, right? Adam Smith, as you guys know, his first book is on a theory of moral sentiments, and David Hume wrote essays on economics and so on, and on property and the importance of property to harness incentives and so on. So, yeah, economists and philosophers have engaged with each other quite a bit. And economists have taken up this problem under the name that you suggested, which is the incommensurability of value problem. Economists are almost always utilitarians. That is, they want to design a political system that maximizes social welfare, regardless of the specific identity of the person, right? So you have to sacrifice one person a bit for 10 people. That's okay, right? It's going to wash out in the end. So yeah, the incommensurability problem, I don't think damns utilitarianism. What it does, and economists have argued this, is it does interfere with our desire to have one person or one small set of people more or less try to aggregate preferences through policy. It tends to lead toward a more, I guess you might say, libertarian political society, because what you want to do is try to figure out, as again Hobbes did, to channel him again, try to figure out what is the minimal set of rules or property rights that helps people achieve their own goals by their own lights. And then once you have that in place, and here Hobbes will diverge from modern economists, economists are going to say, then let people sort of bid on what products they want. Public goods will be a little different, like cleaning up the atmosphere or solving, I don't know, global warming or something. But private goods, we can't compare values. We can't commensurate values, so we need to just let the price mechanism work and let people pursue their own ends. Now, so you can, in other words, still be a utilitarian, but what you probably can't do, and endorse the incommensurability of value, what you probably can't do is think that central planning is going to be a good idea, because the central planner will be, in effect, projecting onto other people what their optimal trade-off schedule is, what their true values are, et cetera. Does that make sense?
It does, and Matt and I talked about this last time, and so here's my objection to that proposed solution, or I mean, I guess solution's too strong of a word, but there inevitably, when you allow people a kind of value pluralism, it affects everybody else, and I just there's no way to escape that problem, which is you can say, well, everybody's just pursuing the good life as they see it. But if my neighbors are pursuing a certain kind of good life, that inevitably affects my life. There's just no way to sequester somebody's existence from my existence. And you can think of any number of examples of this, but like a simple one is just porn. If there's a porn shop downtown and I don't like porn and I find it disgusting and I want to walk downtown, that affects my existence. Now, you might say it's not much of a reason to object to it, that I find it like disgusting and like move on with your life and don't walk downtown. The famous turn off the radio if you don't like what's on. But in my view, that's kind of a glib response, and we'd actually have to take the cost and benefits seriously and think about, is it more harmful than beneficial, etc. But that's not to say I wouldn't end up agreeing with some variant of liberal pluralism. I don't know where I would. I'm becoming more disgruntled with it. I'm open to it still, but I don't think it's a solution to that problem.
Yeah, and an economist named Amartya Sen, who I'm sure you've heard of, a Nobel Prize winner, wrote a little 3-page, heavily mathematical article a few decades ago called The Impossibility of a Paretian Liberal. Paretian meaning Pareto. Pareto now is famous in right-wing circles for his theory of the elites, but Pareto in mainstream economics is quite famous for, this idea that if you can move from one social state to another, whereby everybody is at least as well off and some are better off, none worse off, then that should be preferable, even under this sort of libertarian scheme that I've laid out. That's how economists think about it. So let's take Pareto efficient moves. And Amartya Sen said, wait a minute, we've got a problem. And it's basically what you just outlined. He gives an example of an old book, which I've never heard of, well, outside of his essay, Mrs. Chatterley's Lover. And I guess it was a scandalous...
Yeah,
Lita. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. You guys are more literate than I am. I always use Lolita when I teach this stuff in class
Yeah, it's a
because
good example.
people might have heard of that, and
Yeah.
it was quite scandalous. Yeah. So if I'm reading Lolita on a beach and Bo comes along and, he's a Puritan, as we all know, he's scandalized by this. It's actually too facile for us to say, well, that's not a real harm. That's just psychological harm, or he's just pretending.
Right.
Oh, no. Like, I've lived in Saudi Arabia. I can tell you, they really are offended if you want to eat dinner during Ramadan. They will shut the fucking lights off, cut the electricity, and close you into the restaurant gladly because they think you're a monster that you would actually dare to eat dinner during Ramadan. It's disgusting to them, right? That's real. That's not fake, right? They really are hurt by this.
Right.
And anyway, apart from the fun examples we can come up with, you're right. This is a problem for economists and for utilitarians in particular. On the one hand, they want to more or less say live and let live. We all have different preferences. As Mill said, we have different modes of satisfying our preferences. Different things turn you on and me on. But, this problem, this externality problem is real. And policymakers have to say, okay, wait a minute, but we have to at least assume we can kind of compare preferences, or else we can't do anything, right? Yeah. Even a scheme of property rights where I said, Hobbes is going to start and say, look, let's go with the minimum scheme that we need to get some social order, to minimize violence. And we all go, yeah, that sounds about right. Then let people be. Well, wait a minute. There are some diehard communists who are absolutely disgusted by the idea of private property. And you can't sort of say, well, I'm going to quantify exactly how much they're disgusted. I'm going to compare it against the others. Either this commensurability problem is real and it's deep, or it's a superficial problem. And it turns out, I think we're conflicted on this. On the one hand, all of us think, look, humans do have a basic kind of blueprint. Our psychology tends to be, at a minimum, sort of similar. We all get jealous. We all get hungry. We all want friends. But other than those basic drives, it actually turns out to be remarkably difficult, maybe impossible, to actually aggregate preferences.
So we didn't talk about this in this specific essay on human nature and politics.
Not at all, no.
We're way off already, which I don't care about.
Way off already on point one.
But this is really interesting because I was just having this conversation yesterday about this, which is modern thinkers tend, as you say, to treat disgust as this superficial imaginary harm, right? Like, who cares if you're just disgusted by it? Like, you think take Peter Singer as kind of like the stereotypical example here of somebody who would not treat that as a relevant moral concern in many ways. I mean, maybe that's the tendency at least. So I always say to these people, okay, well, let's suppose that my downtown wanted to hang up pictures of open outhouses, of the outhouse toilets. Okay, well, why would that be morally objectionable? Because it's disgusting. I don't want to look at it, and other people don't want to look at it. And that's a perfectly valid moral objection to something, that it's ugly and hideous, right? Yeah. And that's a real harm, right? It can be a real harm to subject me to something disgusting.
But here's a challenge to that view. As you know, we live in a kind of victimhood culture. And in many cases, once you have those cultural norms in place, people then tend to cultivate victimhood, whereby maybe originally they did it for virtue points. Take Taylor Lorenz, right? Her and the libs of TikTok, feud. Right. And she's always the victim, right? She literally doxed this woman and went to her house and threatened her. And then she just cries on Twitter oh, it's so mean. Why is she, and whatever the underlying merits are of libs of TikTok, I don't want to debate that, but this is a common phenomenon that we see, right? And part of the problem is once we're trying to measure disgust, Bo, is that there is a virtue, a moral virtue in being tolerant. I think we'll all agree with that, right? I'm not saying it's an infinite virtue, but there's always going to be people you disagree with. There's always going to be things you find disgusting. And I know you're much more of a germaphobe than I am. I fucking love germs, right? I'm let's get it on. Immune system, take on the germs, Nietzsche quote, etc. But you're disgusted by it and you're terrified by germs. And I'm Bo, grow the fuck up, and you're like, dude, wait a minute, but you're endangering yourself. And I think what's going on here is sometimes, given certain cultural norms, people will be too easily disgusted or too easily offended. And so actually there's a virtue. I agree with what you said to some extent, but I actually think you're wrong that we should just take this as like automatically somehow morally worthwhile. People are disgusted by all kinds of things that are just stupid. And you just tell them, grow up, dude. Don't be so disgusted.
So
sorry, trying to start a fight here. Let's do it, Bo.
I would say that is absolutely correct, that you have to worry about creating a kind. I don't know if you want to call that it's a kind of moral hazard.
Moral hazard. That's a better
term.
Yeah,
it's like where you're incentivizing. Like one thing. My wife and I make jokes about how utilitarianism ends up giving the crybaby the veto, because like if you're like, exactly, what restaurant should we go to? The person who cares more gets to make the decision, because if you were to do the utility calculus, right? And like, this is what you're saying is like, you're incentivizing people to play the victim, right? Sometimes, oh, I'm so disgusted by this, you guys can't do that. So I guess then what I would say is like, yeah, that's absolutely true. But as you noted, infinite tolerance is not a virtue. And I might compare it to something like, take a different example of like, take literary criticism and praising and condemning things. So like, I think we should be kind of tolerant and be like, yeah, like, look, if people want to read Stephen King, then fine. But if you get to the point where you're indulgent, then nobody aspires to excellence. And then writing gets worse, and like, you're not celebrating the great things in life. It's sort of like, like how Noah Carl has this obsession with classical architecture, right?
Yeah.
So like,
hey, I'm with Noah on this.
Okay, right. But then you would say beauty is important and disgust is important. It guides us, and we don't want our public square to be ugly because it's repellent.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough.
I'm hearing Roger Scruton, the ghost of Roger Scruton, coming through the live stream.
Absolutely.
Beauty is our North Star.
Speaking of disgust and Roger Scruton, the young left-wing version of you would be absolutely disgusted at the current you, channeling Roger Scruton as if that is a legitimate person to quote. Wouldn't you have opposed Roger Scruton 10 years ago? I'm curious.
Me?
Yeah. Like, weren't you like a kind of a far lefty back then?
Yeah, I was, but what's funny is I actually started reading Scruton when I was like 19 or 20, because unlike many people, I had this weird tendency to seek out people with whom I disagreed. So like, I went to like Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton, and actually I liked Scruton even back then. I found some of his arguments kind of preposterous. Like, in one of his books, he ridiculed Oasis, and I'm just like, dude, Oasis, they're pretty cool, man. I think his arguments about, and actually Matt and I talked about this last time, some of his attempts to justify capitalism from a conservative perspective, I think, are rather facile and underwhelming. But he was obviously an interesting thinker. No, I actually did. Yeah, I did. I liked a lot of conservatives, even when I was I guess you would call me a Chomskyite, or pretty close to a Chomskyite, a race realist Chomskyite.
Yes. Well, okay, instead of sticking to the originally we were going to outline that essay, let's run with this point, because here is a big point of contention, something that I think has changed your views and mine. Namely, this idea that, remember, we're thinking about human nature and political philosophy. Once you come to the view that humans are pretty different from each other, both as individuals and as groups. So again, behavioral genetics applied to individuals and groups, so to speak. Meaning, and let me just flesh that out, just the obvious things like intelligence is highly heritable, personality traits are moderately to highly heritable, probably religiosity and political orientation partly piggyback on personality traits, right? Fill in the details. So it turns out like we're pretty different from each other. And yeah, we can be convinced by arguments, but those are limited in their ability to convince us and so on. We all kind of agree with that. So let's call that human biodiversity. That term, I guess, is out of fashion now. I don't really see why. I think it's a pretty good term.
Mm.
Bo wrote a great paper on that back with Boutwell and your brother in 2017. And I remember I cited that paper in my last book, sort of saying, well, there's never been a pan-human nature, which you argue there. And I agree now. Nicholas Wade said that in his book on race realism in 2014. And I think you mentioned it in your review of that. Here's the big problem, the big interesting question. If humans are pretty biodiverse, individuals and groups differ in predictable ways from each other, how does that affect our view of political society? Is liberal democracy, for example, should it be something we aspire to impose on the world? Not by force and bombs, of course, but maybe even by persuasion. Or should we just shut up and sort of just see what people do? Do we have anything to say about this? Are there many different forms of political society for many different kinds of people? What do you think, Bo?
Bo, before you answer that, this is something that I've been thinking about recently. The idea of this really, I know what you call that, this quixotic understanding of human nature of that you find, like the lay understanding of human nature, when actually there are clearly multiple human natures even within pretty homogenous societies, right? And you could break that down just in terms of like intelligence. Right, and you could think about different ways to organize society. So I don't know if you want to trying to incorporate that into your answer as well, kind of like the inter and the intra understanding of different human natures.
Let me add. Sorry to keep bursting in, Bo. Yeah. You got the floor, but I'm here in South America now, and I've lived all over the place and seen lots of different kinds of people in Africa and East Asia. I lived in Singapore. I lived in Saudi. I've lived here. And just to cue you up, I mean, my God, you get very different ways of interacting when you have either low or high trust, which is partly heritable. It's also largely social. But also individualism. And I'm sure you were thinking of this anyway, but I'll cue you up. Like Joe Henrich's thesis that Western Europeans are distinct, he's going to say for purely cultural reasons. I think he knows that that's probably genetic as well. I know you and I believe it's partly genetic.
Yeah, he's
if this is true, it's not just intelligence and personality traits, it's individualism. And my God, do I see a huge difference in Latin America. So just going south from where you are right now, Bo, and you get very different ways of interacting. Trust goes down as soon as you leave the family. And that has consequences for every institution. But anyway, let me, let you speak.
So there are two fundamental, I think, really important topics there. One is about how to think about global political systems. And another is how to think of a political system that's dealing with racial diversity inside one country, right? Which is its own kind of challenge. And I was listening to the Students for Fair Admissions, the affirmative action case, which went to the Supreme Court. And I was just listening to the oral argument, and everybody in it, including the people who were arguing against it, were just uttering the platitude that racial diversity is the greatest thing in the world. And it was driving me batty. I was like, why? Why is it? Like, what is it about this? So I just... that's a complicated thing that we should grapple with. But look, the global one first, I would say this is yours and my, and the other people who have this view, probably our most heterodox view, which to me seems completely commonsensical, though, which is just that in the same way that cultural norms are in some sense attached to the personality characteristics of the peoples who created the culture, so too are their political systems. And so you can imagine that and the differences don't have to be that big with individuals. In the aggregate, that starts to matter. So if you just turn up let's take neuroticism, which we were talking about. So let's just say we have a group that's slightly more neurotic than another group. Maybe when COVID hits, their ideal policy would be very much more toward lockdowns, right? And that makes sense. And that would work for them. Whereas another group of less neurotic and more extroverted people, that would actually be a deleterious exactly. Yeah. See, that would be a deleterious policy because it would actually hurt them not to interact with other
Yes,
humans so much, right? It would
it
be
sure
pernicious.
did. Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
I think, I actually think it's immoral and in some ways monstrous and abhorrent to ignore that and to pretend there's just some universal liberal
Mm.
democracy that fits every kind of people and that we can
yeah,
export it. And don't worry, we'll go to Iraq, we'll break the
Yeah, yeah.
country apart, but you know what'll come out of it? Liberal democracy, because that's the greatest
yeah,
thing ever for every group of people on the planet. And I think it's an abject failure when it's been tried, and it's theoretically it's theoretically risible in my
Mhm.
view, because of course human populations are different from each other, both physically and psychologically, in the same way that Johnny said individuals are. Now, this is the thing that is so, and of course Johnny and I have railed about this and fulminated about this on the phone many times, but like, it is, you can say individuals are different from each other, and nobody, yeah, of course, yeah, so are groups. That's all we're saying. We're saying that in the same way that individuals are different from each other, so are groups on average, and that has significant moral and political
Mm.
consequences, and you have to take that seriously if you want to think about the world accurately.
Um, just
yeah.
to dial in on what you're saying there, but does that mean that you kind of have to eschew the John Stuart Mill idea of higher and lower pleasures when we're talking about something like accounting for, as to use Johnny's example, population A is highly neurotic, and therefore that's going to inform our COVID policy? Or do we actually want to say, look, no, it's consequences all the way down, and one of the consequences of being highly neurotic is blah 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 blah, and in the short, mid, long term, right, or maybe we could say in the short term that might be good for you, but actually we know, right, it is possible to say from a certain vantage point that it would be better for you to just overcome whatever element of your human nature is leading you down this garden path.
So I think those are two separate questions, because the one point you're making is a question about it. Can we simplify it and say that that's a question about short-term versus long-term interest? And could, like, a hypothetical omniscient being know what would be better for you in the long term, even though you would want to make different decisions in the short term because maybe they would feel better? Is that a fair characterization of the point?
Let's run with that.
Okay, because like, so like the reason I think those are two separate questions is because in the example, at least what I had in mind was a case where actually the long-term effects were also different for the different
Mm-hmm.
groups. So
Mm-hmm.
again, let's take a different one where it's easier to see. Let's just go extrovert versus introvert. And let's suppose that the introverts are very satisfied for their whole life with only one or two close relationships. And I can relate to this because I'm very introverted. So like, to me, it's not it doesn't detract from meaning. It doesn't make me feel empty that I'm not around big groups of people. I know other people, Johnny's probably one of them actually, who get a sort of excitement and a feeling of like that sublime feeling of belonging to a huge crowd. And that's very meaningful to them. I think huge crowd disgusting, can't stand it. Am I going to get trampled to death in this crowd or get some horrible disease? But some people find that exhilarating and very meaningful. So if we had two groups that were different on average in those traits, the cost benefit, even in the long run, ratio of COVID policies would be different. And if we were morally responsible, we would have to take that into account. And the Procrustean bed of our ideology wouldn't work. We can't put everything onto that, right? We really have to think about the specific characteristics of the people involved. Now, I do actually think Mill was right, Matt, but I do think that's a separate question.
So, Johnny, unless you want to come back in there, I'm happy
Actually,
to move forward.
let me comment on this. So I'm giving a TED talk on Thursday, actually, on this topic, and it's all part of this whole thing, launching this class. Well, TEDx, it's a small thing, whatever. It's not
Whatever.
like
Same,
you're flying to
call it Ed.
Boston.
It's all right.
Yeah, yeah, whatever. Fake TED. I'm giving a fake TED talk on Thursday, but my last slide actually features Procrustes. So the myth of
There
the
we go.
Procrustean bed. And the reason for it, and this is like, so, it's a pretty standard talk. I mean, I guess not many people talk about this subject, but, it's not pushing the limits too far, but I do push it at the end, drop some red pills or whatever. And the final topic where I do that is, well, we should either pay attention to human nature when we're designing political institutions in a way that's sort of, I don't know, that's not a radical statement, make policies incentive compatible. If you want less pollution, don't sort of just will it away, but you should tax it in the right way and so on. Okay, that's all obvious. But I say, look, either we need to alter our political institutions so that they accord better with human nature, or we might change human nature to fit our political institutions. And when we were writing this essay, I remember last year, Bo, you were like, I don't know if we should put that in there, right? But I put it in the talk.
I did.
And the reason is,
yeah.
it's partly provocation. Obviously, we're not going to radically transform human nature in a generation or two, but it actually is quite a serious point over the next 100 to 200 years. I do think embryo selection and CRISPR is going to be more powerful. And I do think, and this is really the point of that slide and that of putting that in the talk and in this discussion, it does bring home this idea that once people understand heritability and they understand that the traits of a population are what matters, it does probably lead them to rethink, like, what are we trying to do with the political society and how achievable are certain values, And I do think it's interesting to add that, at least over the really long run, right? Over 200 years, over 1,000 years, we really could potentially change human nature in a way that makes it more compatible with socialism. I don't want to do that, but it's not inconceivable. It's not crazy. I mean,
you're the human debating becoming a vampire. If you were the more socialistic person, you would be like, hey, this is cool.
Yeah, exactly. And, I sort of took that line because, Jason Brennan and Jerry Cohen are two famous socialists and capitalists. So Jerry Cohen was an Oxford philosopher, wrote a book called Why Not Socialism? And it's probably the best case that's ever been made for socialism. He identifies the two main moral virtues. And then he says, look, let's imagine a camping trip, where it's just a bunch of friends and colleagues. And, you would think it's crazy to like attach prices to using, my pot to heat your coffee or whatever, even bartering, he thinks would be immoral under that circumstance, right? We would just sort of share. And he says, well, why not, apply that to society more broadly? And of course, there are many reasons we could think, why not? But Jay Brennan, at Georgetown, writes a book called Why Not Capitalism? And he does the same exercise for the moral virtues of capitalism. And he says, look, you got to compare real capitalism against real socialism, not hypothetical socialism against real capitalism. Of course, there are evils with both. But in that book, Why Not Socialism, Jerry Cohen makes a remarkable claim, which is what's behind my claim now that we could change human nature. He says, look, I've shown how great socialism is. And if people aren't good enough for socialism, then too bad for people. It's like, holy shit, man, that is a bullet to bite right there. Like, wow, he said that, and he means it. And my response is, actually, maybe he's right. If we could actually, I don't want socialism, but like we could, in principle, now transform human nature to make us more compatible with socialism. Why not?
That's a very fascinating. My instinct is to be like absolutely disgusted by the too bad for humans. And here's one like I find people will do this. They'll make arguments. Like I've heard Sam Harris talk about how in some sense it's like a moral failure that you care more about your family than you do about a stranger or something, or that like I would choose like if there's a burning building with 100 strangers or my wife, I'm letting the 100 strangers die. And but to me, that's not a moral failure. And it's actually like, it's an insult to humans to take this fantasy world and then to compare humans to this fantasy world, right? And actually, Johnny, this is part of the point they were making is precisely that you have to come to terms with human nature, and in your fantasy world. In some ways, it's diminishing the real. I don't want to get too poetic here, but majesty of humanity, to compare them and say, oh, they're this pallid failure compared to the grandeur of
Right.
my imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like Don Quixote. And you've seen the images by Gustave Doré. He painted a lot of famous images of famous books, and his images of Don Quixote are fantastic. It's just him in his study, imagining all these dragons and windmill monsters, and we laugh at it precisely because, on the one hand, there is a virtue with trying to imagine something better than what we now have and trying to effectuate it. And in fact, my favorite Don Quixote isn't the book; it's the adaptation, Man of La Mancha, the musical. And it's really an optimistic take on actually, Don Quixote is kind of right. You should be striving for something better. But I take it the take-home lesson of Don Quixote and the Gustave Doré paintings are, yeah, but don't take your fantasy too far, right? It results in a pile of corpses if you do.
Right.
So,
And also it results in a diminishment of real humans. Like in some ways, it
right.
causes you to recoil from reality, which this is why I've said to people, I think conservatism at its best convinces people to revere what is real and not to reject it for something imaginary. Now, look, I love romantic poets. I love Don Quixote. I even find his character inspiring in some ways. And like, I don't want to ridicule the imagination, but I do think when you start comparing real humans to imaginary humans, and you say, well, this is this great moral failure of real humans that we have, like, say, tribal impulses. I get nervous about that, both because it just, sort of rejects reality, but also because, as you said, it ends up with, like many corpses later, people admit, oh yeah, we can't actually achieve that.
This is a really good segue, I think, for effective altruism, because it seems that
Hate it.
Perfect. As Will McCaskill, for example, his book is doing very well. He's New Yorker, New York Times profiles. As he rises to the top of this movement, I guess in a way supplanting Peter Singer. Many people, especially on the right, have come out with different critiques. Scott Alexander has posted about this. Mary Harrington has written about it for Unheard. Do you think, Bo, that the effective altruist is fundamentally this kind of I don't want to be too harsh, but this spurgy 20-something male, and all props to them for accurately identifying the appropriate use of one's money at a certain scale, but the movement itself, the philosophy itself, it has scalability problems. Would that be a fair summary of your instinct, your view?
It is, and also, like, there are some problems with their assumptions on what would be better, which Johnny and I have talked about. Which, I mean, you have to accept some politically incorrect facts before you could actually do a real effective altruism. But I would also say, I just don't share their underlying. So like, I think you have to, like, there's sort of like a practical effective altruism, which is just like, let's figure out, like, where our money can do the most. And for the, other things equal, that seems like a fine idea to me. Like, if I decide that I want to help animals, I would like somebody to tell me, where can I best put my money? What's going to do the most? What percentage of the charity donations do they actually spend on what they say they're going to spend it on, etc. But then there's the more abstract philosophical framework, which tends to be utilitarian. And I will say I'm a lapsed utilitarian. Excuse me. At one time, I thought that was. I don't think I ever thought it was, like, exactly right in some Platonic sense, but I thought it made the most sense of any moral system you could forward. I no longer think that. I think it's perfectly reasonable to care more about some people than other people and to prioritize their well-being. And I do that in my life, and so does everyone else. And unlike some of these people, I guess, I don't have a philosophical objection to that. I care more about people in my community than people in other communities. I care more about my friends than other people. And I care more about people in my country than other people. And if you gave me a choice between the utility, quote unquote, of people in my country and people in another country, I would pick my own country. I care about my tribe more. That doesn't mean I want to, conquer other people and take their stuff for my tribe. It just means I care more about certain people than others, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And in fact, to me, the idea that you shouldn't do that is preposterous. I think it's a grave moral mistake.
Yeah, this
and
is
also,
interesting.
Possible we'd even, yeah. Go ahead.
I'll just finish with one point, which is like, I do think these get kind of complicated, but I do think there are some effective reductios of certain versions of utilitarianism in which what we should be striving for is people whose well-being is just above being alive is preferable to dead, and then have as many consciousnesses as possible. So like the best of all worlds would be like 38 billion people who are 5.1 in well-being. And I think that's ridiculous. I think that's a pretty good reductio.
Well, that's, as you know, that's disputed in utilitarianism. So
yes,
total
it is.
and average
I
utilitarianism.
agree. That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah. Yep. I guess they would of course reply that a good utilitarian, given a view of human nature, namely that we are partial toward friends and family and always will be, this is part of our nature. What they'll say is you would want to take that into account in the calculations and either allow or even foster partiality. That's not actually inconsistent with utilitarianism any more than it's inconsistent, as you well know, for a utilitarian in a position of power to denounce utilitarianism itself, right? The paradox of utilitarianism. It can be both true and effective for you to say that it's false. And that's just one modern version of a noble lie. Many different political theorists, starting with Plato, have advocated noble lies on a pretty massive scale. Actually, I will say Plato's noble lie is much closer to the truth, though, than the utilitarian noble lie would be. Because remember, Plato's supposed noble lie is the myth of the metals, where he actually says throughout the book, like, people are very different from each other. Some are incapable of virtue, others. And then he says, we'll tell a myth, this noble lie, namely that there's gold, silver, and bronze. But actually, it's not really a myth at all. You really think that. But anyway, so there is a response by utilitarians. But yeah, I don't want to get too much into the weeds. You know how that goes back and forth. I will say I agree with you on one point. Go ahead.
I'll ask you the question. You finish, and then I'll ask
about effective altruism. I just had this conversation with a guy in that movement a few days ago, and he had a pretty good defense of it against my objections. But I guess the fundamental objection I have, and Bo, I'm sure you share this, is that some of the leaders are more worried about their own careers than they are about, and how they're perceived publicly, than they are about getting to the truth. And I'm not going to name names. I can just say that I have had a long interaction, a very friendly one with one of those people, maybe the most famous one, and in private in Oxford. And he was willing to talk about all kinds of topics that are off limits in the effective altruism movement. He would never talk about these things publicly. And I think that's a bit self-defeating. I mean, the best response is, okay, well, look, we need to sell the product, right? We want to bring people a little bit more rational, a little bit more into our spheres, and we can't alienate people by just being like, hey, there's race differences or whatever, right? You can't start with that.
Right.
On the other hand, that's just, kind of one example. I'm not saying they should all talk about group differences. That's not my point. It's that there are some pretty important phenomena of the kind we discussed, even individual differences, heritability scores, and so on. And once you take that seriously, you move from a framework whereby you're like, well, how do we spend this dollar in this public school a little more effectively? Do we buy them breakfast? or do we buy this book? No, that's the wrong calculus, right? Like once you understand human biodiversity, you're just barking up the wrong tree. And that's my real problem here. It's not that they won't say all of the politically incorrect things. Of course they won't. Nobody does that, right? Even you don't do that, Bo.
Right.
But like, but like there are some fundamental beliefs about the world, which I believe to be true, and I think all of us here do, which would completely transform every calculation they do if they started propagating those beliefs. So that's my objection to EA. It's not EA in principle. But.
So the question that I was going to put to you, Johnny, was, is it consequences all the way down, right? Because this is kind of what the utilitarian would say, right? Is that we can do the calculation, but of course there comes a point when you can accept a metaphysical level that it's consequences all the way down. But we're not omniscient, so we can't know them. And at that point, you kind of have to say, well, what do we do? And it seems that there's obviously this overlap, as I alluded to before by calling these people spurgy, between the utilitarians and the rationalists, right? Who will, if you don't have overwhelming counter evidence for a belief, a lot of these people will just be like, oh no, I'm not going to change my mind. And to me, that seems like a shortcoming of this type of mentality, because it prevents you from just taking a leap of faith, taking a risk in your life. If you've not, you can't look at the peer-reviewed evidence for everything. I remember Richard Hanania wrote recently about who to vote for, and he said, people say Obama knew more. He had his head on his shoulders, and he knew all about policy and what his government was doing. And Richard's point was simply, look, even if that's true, what did he know? What, maybe like 1% of what his administration was doing compared to Trump, who maybe knew like 0.1%. Sure. Like it's just there's too much going on. I think that's kind of a nice analogy here, because once you don't know what the consequences are, you have to fall back on instincts. Do the utilitarians then call these instincts consequences? It kind of becomes almost tautologous in a way.
Look, you could. First of all, there is common sense. I mean, I know none of us, like with our scientific hats on, want to be like, well, it's all common sense, right? Special relativity or whatever, the germ theory of disease is not all common sense. But like clearly when it comes to the social realm, like, I don't know, do certain rules work well? Do certain traditions work well? Like probably common sense beats social science. In fact, I'm very certain it does, right? Social science from the last 50 years. So there's something.
Stereotypes aren't real.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's right. So look, I mean, we do sometimes fall back on that. We do that in ordinary life. We ask our grandparents, at least if we're humble and we want to know how to raise kids, like we know they're not perfect, but we might ask them for some general like suggestions, things like this. And we could, in principle, if social science was more diverse politically and otherwise, maybe we'd come to, if we had a better social science, we could actually have a social science of what kinds of rules to follow, what kinds of traditions to follow. And if it was done well, the way Bo might envision it, that would itself depend on the population you're studying. So the rules for Ethiopians or for Koreans might be different. And we're just like maximally open to saying like, I don't know what the best rules are. Probably as a rough proxy, let's go with tradition until we can study incremental ways of improving human welfare. And we can do that through the lens of social science. It just turns out when social science is corrupt as it is now, a utilitarian has to just throw up his hands. And it's not an argument against utilitarianism. That requires a value claim. Rather, it's an argument that utilitarianism is hard and that sometimes we can be confident in experts and other times we can't. And when we can't, you should shun them and go with, let's say, tradition and things like this. So,
well, this is what I was going to say, which is like the more conservative perspective or answer, I think, to Matt's question would be, this is exactly why we should defer to tradition, because tradition has suffered and changed through the exigencies of survival, right? And so it has a built-in wisdom that no single individual could possibly comprehend. And I think I guess it's telling of the state of like public discourse in the United States, or probably in the West more broadly, that many of these conservative arguments, which maybe one disagrees with them, but they're quite compelling in my view and profound, are not even voiced in the mainstream, which is just the difficulty of rationally assessing something. So like, as you said, with the Obama new 1%, what does Obama know about society? Like literally 0.0001%, right? We're all
Right.
in the dark. And when we see an institution, now I think criticism is good and we can think about that, but we look at an institution and like the youthful instinct, the Chomskyan instinct, you might say, is to think, and in fact, Chomsky says this, so this is interesting. His argument is power is presumptively wrong. Like you have to justify that institution. I think the truth is almost exactly the opposite, which is you really have to make a strong case against an institution or a norm that's been around because cultural evolution selected for it, and it likely does something of which you are entirely ignorant.
And
that
biological evolution.
Pardon?
Biological evolution, because the first power relation that you encounter is with your parents, right? And that's not presumptively wrong.
Chomsky would
parents
argue
control you.
That probably is.
Yeah.
Or it should be at least.
Yeah, I mean, like his line, I remember him saying this was, if I grab my niece's hand as she runs out into the road, I do have to justify that, but it's an easy justification to make, right?
But presumably, like Chomsky would think, like, okay, like many of these institutions that conservatives venerate and attempt to promote, the church, traditional sex roles, marriage, they're all like, you can't justify them, you can't defend them, and the onus is on you to do it. And again, I think precisely the opposite is the case for like sex roles is a good example. They're under a sustained assault right now. I mean, like there's no other way to put it. I mean, we're to the point where I can call myself whatever sex I want to be, and you have to appreciate it, and everybody's non-binary. There's
and be attracted to you.
Yes, and you have to, if you don't have attraction to somebody because of their genitals, that's some new kind of phobia, right? And there are people who are theys and z's and re's, and like, look, I understand. I could talk to these people one-on-one, and that's fine. I don't have any like personal animus toward them, but I do think it's a selfish act to break apart sex roles, which are these, they developed over a very long period of time. They contain a lot of wisdom about how to guide a person in his or her life. Like, what should I do? Like these questions, like the idea that what you should do is step outside of life, reflect very carefully on everything and be like, I want to get a job and not have a kid. And I've decided that rationally with no outside influence. And that's like the ultimate act of freedom. I think that's preposterous, right? It's this myth of like this rational self-creating self. We're always the product of cultural norms and institutions. We should want them to guide us in certain ways that are salubrious and meaningful.
Bo, I want to follow this up here. I've been moving politically, and I know you have too. I mean, over the years,
to fascism?
The main fault that you and I have is being like we're sort of maximally open to new ideas to the point where we'll just like renounce our former selves and views. So I have this paper that I don't like the conclusion of, but I'm forced to accept. And that's called "Can Liberalism Last?" or "Is Liberalism Sustainable?" I think I shared it with you a year ago. Yes. We have a follow-up to it. And the argument, I don't want to go through it, but the argument in a nutshell is liberalism actually tends toward norms that do things like you're talking about. So low birth rates, low cohesion, social cohesion, et cetera. Even though that was not part of 19th century British liberalism, no doubt. But it seems to be a trend, and I'm worried that it might be a kind of global trend, and maybe liberalism in the long run is quite literally evolutionarily unstable. Leave that aside. That may be true, may not be true. My follow-up to it with one of my co-authors is called, I think tentatively we're calling it enlightened tribalism. And we're trying to defend a view that is, it's not anti-liberal, but it's sort of post-liberal, you might say. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Bo, because you have this paper with Corey called Tribalism is Human Nature. And you tend to be a liberal. I know by disposition, you certainly are. You're very tolerant. You like living in a liberal society and so on. Do you think you can square tribalism and liberalism? And I don't just mean at any particular instant in time, but over time. Can liberalism last? Is it compatible with these tribal features of human nature? What do you think?
It's a great question. And so you're right. I think by disposition, I am liberal in that I tend to have a more live and let live attitude personally. Like if I see something with which I disagree, I'm not compelled to insult it or argue against it necessarily. But I've actually become much more skeptical of liberalism even over the past year. So you're asking me at a time in which I'm post-liberal curious.
Yeah.
And I think it's,
Speaking of different sexualities, yeah.
Right, exactly. By the way,
curious.
for anybody who is my enemy who somehow heard this, I'm not actually a fascist. That was a joke. Just want to let you know. But
They've already clipped it, Bo. It's already clipped. It's on YouTube.
It's too late. It's too late.
I am actually post-liberal curious. I am I do think I think your arguments and other people's arguments about liberalism are correct, unfortunately. And in fact, I think the really difficult thing about liberalism is that liberalism has to be illiberal to preserve itself. Right. And this is something people have recognized.
Exactly.
But once it starts to fail, so like take open borders, because the progressive will say, well, what could be, and the economist will say, what could be more illiberal than shutting your border to people and not allowing the free movement of peoples? But you will never preserve a liberal system if you have 100% open borders. It will fall apart. And why? Think of the example of the evolutionary stable strategy with which we started this conversation. What happens when you open a liberal society's borders to anybody? Too many people who will exploit it come in and they do exploit it, and it breaks apart and fails. And so liberalism has to be illiberal to preserve itself. And I think too few people are willing to be illiberal anymore and just say like, look, and I think it was easier to be illiberal when our elite had a much more triumphant image of their own civilization. Like, as you know, Johnny and Matt, like we've lamented this, like our elite are masochists now. They've internalized this like Howard Zinn narrative that like white Europeans are uniquely pernicious, evil actors in the world and have to suffer some penance for this to hopefully expiate the angry woke gods, right? And it's so bizarre to me because I think the only way you can preserve liberalism is to have this attitude. We're the best fucking civilization that's ever existed. Now, every civilization thinks that, and that's fine. I want ours to think that too. And we're going to protect this, and we're going to inculcate the norms into our children that we're awesome. Look, like talk about the noble lie. Like this is an interesting argument, but I used to debate my brother about this because he would complain that this was propaganda. And I said, yeah, of course it is. Third graders you're not going to teach third graders a dispassionate array of facts. You have to propagandize people into your civilization and teach people the virtues of the civilization. And for many reasons, some of which you point out in your article, Johnny, liberal societies, at some point, they stop doing that. And then they have low fertility rates. They have to replace their population with peoples from elsewhere, which isn't always bad, but sometimes those people don't share the liberal values, and it does start, and also racial diversity almost inevitably decreases trust, which puts further strain on liberalism. So, Johnny, I'm actually interested in your idea because I've been trying to figure out what is a post-liberal alternative with which I can feel I full harmony would be like, that's a utopian idea, but with which I can feel comfortable, because I am not a big fan of like the sort of Catholic integralism or the Deninism or this much more religious variant of post-liberalism.
Yeah.
And Johnny, before you come in there, I just want to throw in an extra comment relating to what you said, Bo, about this weird Howard Zinn view that our elites seem to have. It's curious to me that in addition to that view, there's also this kind of like weird prelapsarian notion of like everywhere man is kind, right? So this literally gets people killed because you hear stories of young women going solo backpacking to often, it seems, majority Muslim countries and being raped and killed. So the level of cognitive dissonance is, to me, bizarre. But anyway, Johnny, I'll
by the way, let me just add to that prelapsarian view. There's also, this is very related to the anti-Western hostility. There's also like what you might call the dances with wolves idealization of quote indigenous populations, or like this view that like the only people who were conquering other people and killing them were white Europeans. It's like everybody was fucking doing it. We were just doing it a lot better, right? Like, you know, it's not as if
part of it is gunpowder and just a few basic pieces of technology. It was just more efficient. Yeah,
right.
I mean,
right.
Anyway,
So anyway,
of course.
To you, Johnny.
Well, I have to run in a few minutes, so I don't have time to really develop a full-throated defense of tribalism. But yeah, I mean, what we're trying to do is defend, I guess you could say, I know you've talked about nationalism, Bo, a view in which there's a kind of virtue in the way that Plato and Aristotle thought, uniquely attached to your tribe, but not at the expense of other tribes necessarily, right? So I think that you can capture the benefits of trade, even international trade, although there are dangers there. I mean, we've seen like the bigger international corporations become, the less responsive they are to local populations. So there's this trade-off, like having global trade reduces prices, increases quality, new products, et cetera. But it also can make your government and your governors more responsive to these corporations and so on. So I do think there's a vision whereby you can keep, you know, some of the benefits of trade and liberalism in that sense, you know, using the price mechanism, private property rights, equality under the law, which we were going to talk about. Some of these virtues that really we discover from England. I mean, England exported them to the world, while nevertheless maintaining a strong nationalism, whether it's religiously based or otherwise. There are many bases for nationalism, as you know. But yeah, in other words, like we want to develop a view whereby there is a virtue associated with nationalism or tribalism. It is considered actually good, not neutral or bad, in the way that you mentioned, Bo, to be uniquely attached to your people, however defined, while simultaneously recognizing that there's a virtue from refraining from imposing your worldview on everyone else. And I don't know if that's a stable way of doing things, but basically our targets are people like Alan Buchanan, who I greatly admire. He's been nothing but good to me. He was a friend and colleague at Duke University. Now he's at Arizona in his retirement. And I know, Bo, you had a debate with him on Quillette.
He wrote for Quillette.
But I think his views are wrong. And yeah, if people want to see Alan Buchanan's views distilled, these are the best defenses of liberalism you can possibly have. Alan Buchanan he's bright, he's open-minded, he's a lefty to his dying day. You know, he is an internationalist, you might say, so to speak, and his views are deeply informed by evolutionary biology. So if you read his books or his essay at Quillette, to me, that's the best case for liberalism. And that's our target. We actually think he's just misguided. We think that, well, human biodiversity clearly matters, and that has to be taken more seriously. But secondly, we don't see it as a virtue, as he and Peter Singer do, to sort of indefinitely extend our circle of concerns. We think there's a real virtue, going back to a point you previously made, in endorsing a kind of enlightened tribalism. It doesn't mean we have to look at the world through a zero-sum lens. It doesn't mean our victories come at the expense of everyone else. That's the wrong way of looking at it, we think. So it's not a question of universal liberalism versus tribalistic fascism, which is kind of how it's usually painted. No. We can have tribalism without having this outward aggression. At least I think that's the view we're trying to develop.
Yeah, that's almost exactly what my worldview is. Although I think it poses a challenge internationally, and I'm kind of a
Yep.
hawk internationally, and I would just admit it. Like, I
Yeah.
want American hegemony. I think it's
What?
better for.
Oh, not me. We're a
So
force
you're
for evil. Oh, jeez. Here we disagree. Go ahead, give your view.
but I guess like foreign policy is its own complicated world, so I won't get too into that. I will
Yeah.
say I think this is precisely what is needed is actually, and for that Quillette essay, I wrote the tribalism is good. That was my part
Yeah.
of the debate. And
Yeah.
I think it's this odd thing that this perverse reflex to denounce tribalism as if tribalism is the root of all human error and social ill.
Right.
And it's not. I think tribalism, in fact, is beautiful is too strong of a word, perhaps, but let's say this it's actually necessary for society. You always need a way to determine who's your in group, who are the people I can trust, and who's my out group. That's just like the fundamental human need in the social world, in group, out group.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, you don't have a society.
Yeah. And baseball, I hate to insult your favorite sport, but baseball it's a good outlet, but it's a cheap outlet. It's if you instead identify with a nation, with a people, I think it's a much deeper sense of meaning that you
Yes.
get, or with a
Yeah.
neighborhood even. I mean,
Yeah.
my parents live in a tiny town in California, and it might as well be on Mars. I mean, they don't identify with the rest of California. They don't want other people to live there. This is like the perfect example of high trust, low crime community. They have their little flags. Los Osos is the name of the city, which just means the bears in Spanish. And they've got the little bear flags and bear statues. And it's natural. This is how we live. And they are the most peaceful people. Well, they're mostly retired. So of course they're peaceful, but yeah, I mean, sports in my view is just a cheap substitute. That's not to say it's a bad thing, but it's just a cheap substitute for what we really need. And these rituals,
yeah.
these people to identify with. And I think it's a delicate balance. So I agree with you internationally in one way. My view is tribalism, even the enlightened variety I advocated, there's always going to be a danger of it leaking into, you might call it colonialism or violent, offensive wars and so on. But I just think that's part of human nature as well. And so what we're trying to do is identify the best parts of human nature, identify the virtues of cooperation and trade. Those are real virtues, right? We all get richer. We're all better. And try to tamp down zero-sum thinking. It's not ever going to be possible to completely do that. But to sort of say, look, I mean, there are victories we can score together. I don't need to conquer you in order to feel good about myself. But by the way, I am better than you. Like we're better than you. So fuck you. Right. But like, that doesn't mean I want to kill you or like, enslave
but it's
you.
weird. It's weird that attitude, this attitude that like, yeah, of course it's awesome that I'm an American is considered like uncouth or outre by to modern intellect. It's like, I also think, as you've been saying with sports, this disparagement of nationalism or tribalism or whatever by many of these hyper educated, what Goodacre would call anywheres, right? These people who are utterly cosmopolitan, hyper-educated, they can thrive anywhere. What they're doing is they're destroying meaning for people like my grandfather, who was in the army and raised the American flag every morning and thought that was this meaningful thing. And they mock that as like mawkish and myopic and like, look at these idiots rallying around the flag. Right? And I think there's just like this maybe it's even thoughtless, just like elitism that leads to this derisive attitude, but it might be more malicious than that. It might be this kind of signaling, we're so sophisticated, look at these rubes who have to rally around their local tribes.
I think that's definitely it. There's no doubt about it. And you show your sophistication. And just to wrap this up, actually the final point we made in our essay, Human Nature and Political Philosophy, last year, is on this point. Why do elites behave in ways in the West that could actually destroy their own position? In other words, they're destroying the foundations of their own society, either for themselves or their kids, over a 20 or 50-year period. And one of the things that we argue is, I guess this was my part, but I think you agree with this, that in politics, virtue signaling, this has become a universal term now, but this has always been a feature of politics. In markets, you get what you pay for, right? I hand over the $20,000 for a car. I have to live with that goddamn car now, right? So I have to be really careful about which car I pick out, what the opportunity cost is. In markets, you get what you pay for. In politics, you get what other people vote for. You have very little influence on politics, on electoral outcomes. And so the cost of acting expressively is basically zero. The cost of saying something that either you don't believe or you do believe, but you wouldn't if you had to pay the cost of holding that belief, right? Is really cheap. So one of the unique features about elites, especially in democratic societies, is they don't pay the direct costs of their badly formed beliefs. And if there's anything we can do to save democracy or liberalism, it's going to be to impose costs on the elites or set up a set of structures such that when they say things like defund the police, like it really is more likely that their home is going to get attacked, not just some poor, whatever, suburban home or something like that. So, I mean, this is one explanation for why we get these pathologies. The cost of announcing your fealty to some insane ideology is close to zero, and the benefits can be significant if you're a university professor, which is why Bo and I are not anymore, or if you're the right kind of politician or whatever, right? So
it's
anyway, that's my closing thought on that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that, though, because there are some like I was just thinking about this. So Macy's had an ad for a DEI worker making $200,000 a year, and I was thinking, okay,
how do I apply?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. But there's the joke about the neoclassical economist joke about how at equilibrium there are no $20 bills on the ground because of course everybody's found them. How the fuck do we have such an abundance of profits that we can dump $200K to a DEI officer, right? It's just like, that actually is a cost for Macy's. I mean, I suppose we could figure out maybe they're somehow making it back, but like, that's a lot of money.
No, they pass it along to consumers, obviously, right? So
okay, right. But then the traditional economy, the economic theory would be, somebody's going to make a Macy's that doesn't have DEI workers making $200K and sell you cheaper products.
This sounds like a book for Brian Kaplan.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And as you know, the economic theory, from the 1950s that we're all self-interested and so on, nobody ever actually, well, I should say very few ever proposed that as the correct complete view of human nature.
Yeah, fair.
It was always supposed to be for price theory, like other things equal, I'm going to choose the lower priced product and so on. And then they generalize from that to everything, including politics, right? So public choice theory is born when economists start thinking about politics. They import those self-interested assumptions. But one of the things that smart economists, thoughtful economists, including Kaplan, in the last, say, 30 years have done is made the psychology of the consumer, producer, policymaker, policy taker a bit richer. So it's not that we're perfectly selfless rather than egoistic, but we're kind of tribal creatures. We do care about things other than prices. And I think a successful social science, especially economics, will have to take account of these things we see around us, whereby, again, companies, large corporations, are not just able to be successful by making a profit, but they have to show that they're doing it in a certain way and appeal to people's predispositions to want them to behave morally. This is just like part of, maybe it's always been with us. It's just like worse than it is now. But yeah, I mean, consumers care about more things than just saving money. And companies are now, of course, taking that into account. Although I think, like you probably do too, Bo, in a very malicious way, or in a very, not malicious, in a very short-sighted way. So what they want to do is advertise to the consumer we're doing good in the world without actually necessarily doing good in the world, right? It's just shameless from the standpoint of the company. And for economic models to really work, they're going to have to take into account those factors, I think. A richer consumer psychology, a richer producer psychology, and then this fundamental insight that unless you as an individual bear the direct cost of your bad belief, you're going to go ahead and indulge those bad beliefs when in the broader scheme of things, it's socially beneficial to do so. So,
yeah.
Sorry, that was long-winded, but you know.
No,
that's nice.
yeah.
I like the idea of woke washing as well. And I think we could,
Yeah.
if the late David Graeber could come back and write a book with Brian Kaplan on these price inefficiencies and why Macy's can charge $200,000 a year,
And
that would
needs
be
to.
a book I would,
Yeah.
and need to. That would be a book I would.
They might even
certainly
fail
read.
if they don't have a DEI officer at this point. Like that's how crazy
Yeah.
things have gotten. Yeah. Anyway, thanks
well,
you guys. I gotta run here, but
yeah, and thank you so much to Johnny and Bo for coming on, and thank you to everybody for turning up. Obviously, we didn't get through the whole article, but I think it was a very interesting discussion. And
we didn't come close.
Post this. We didn't come close, but we will post this as a podcast. It'll be up in the next few weeks, and yeah, we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
All right, cheers.